Running out of fuel on a motorway isn't just embarrassing and inconvenient. It's a genuine driving offense in this country, carrying a fine and points on your license. And with fuel prices where they've been recently, more drivers are stretching their tank further than ever trying to save a few pounds. Let's break down exactly why this is treated so seriously, what the actual penalty looks like, and why the money-saving instinct behind it could end up costing you far more than the fuel you were trying to save. Here's the rule most drivers have simply never heard properly, tucked away in Rule 97 of the Highway Code. Before you set off on a journey, you're required to ensure you have enough fuel or charge for it, and that requirement doesn't disappear once you're already moving. Running dry on a motorway specifically isn't treated as bad luck or an unfortunate accident. It's classified as an offense of careless driving, because the law takes the view that a driver who genuinely checked their fuel level before setting off, and planned accordingly, simply shouldn't end up stranded in a live lane. The penalty for that offense is a £100 fixed penalty notice and 3 points on your license, issued on the spot, and if it escalates to court rather than being dealt with as a fixed penalty, the fine can climb as high as £2,500. It's worth understanding exactly why this specific scenario gets treated so much more seriously than, say, breaking down with a genuine mechanical fault. Because the distinction the law draws here is deliberate, rather than arbitrary. A mechanical failure is generally accepted as something outside your control. Running out of fuel is viewed differently, because the law assumes you had full control over checking your gauge and refueling before setting off, and choosing not to is treated as a failure of basic planning rather than misfortune. On a motorway specifically, that failure creates a genuinely serious hazard, a stationary vehicle in a live lane with traffic passing at speed, which is exactly why the careless driving classification exists here, rather than treating it as a simple breakdown. Now let's talk about why this has become a more relevant warning than it was a couple of years ago. Because the behavior driving people into this exact situation has genuinely increased. And it's worth understanding the psychology behind it rather than just the statistics. With petrol and diesel prices climbing amid ongoing global instability, and drivers currently paying well over £1.50 a litre for petrol and considerably more for diesel, the instinct to hunt down the cheapest possible forecourt has intensified noticeably. Breakdown providers have been directly warning about this pattern, with industry experts pointing out that the search for savings can ironically create exactly the expensive situation drivers are trying to avoid. Driving several extra miles out of your way, or delaying a fill-up specifically to reach a cheaper station further away, means running your tank closer to empty than you normally would. And that's precisely the behavior that leads to running dry in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time. Here's the math that makes this such a genuinely bad trade-off financially, even before you factor in the points. And it's worth sitting with these numbers for a moment because they rarely add up the way people assume in the moment they're deciding whether to drive that extra mile. Say you're chasing a saving of 3 or 4 pence per litre by driving to a cheaper station a few miles further away. On a full tank, that might realistically save you somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 pounds, occasionally more on a larger vehicle. Against that modest saving, you're weighing a £100 fixed penalty, 3 points that affect your insurance for years afterward, and breakdown recovery charges that can easily run into hundreds of pounds if you do end up stranded on a motorway specifically, since recovery from a live lane typically costs considerably more than a standard roadside call-out due to the specialist equipment and road closure coordination required. The economics simply don't work in favor of pushing your tank right to the edge to chase a small saving. It's worth understanding what actually happens if you do find yourself running critically low on a motorway, because the guidance here matters just as much as the penalty itself. If your fuel warning light comes on, that's your signal to leave at the very next exit or service station, not to press on hoping you'll make it to a specific station you had in mind. If you genuinely do run out while driving, indicate early, move across to the hard shoulder or nearest safe refuge area if the road has one, get your hazard lights on immediately, and exit the vehicle from the passenger side if it's safe to do so, moving well away from the live carriageway rather than remaining in or near the vehicle. Calling for recovery at that point is exactly the right move, and being honest with the operator about exactly what happened helps them send the appropriate assistance rather than delaying things further. Breakdown providers generally treat a fuel-related call-out as urgent, precisely because a stationary vehicle in a live lane is considered high risk regardless of the cause. So you're unlikely to face a significantly longer wait purely because the reason was avoidable rather than mechanical. even though the penalty side of things is handled separately from the recovery itself. There's a broader principle worth taking from this that applies well beyond just fuel specifically. The Highway Code's requirement to plan your journey properly before setting off covers more than just what's in your tank. It reflects a wider expectation that drivers take reasonable, foreseeable steps to avoid creating a hazard for other road users, and running low on fuel is treated as squarely within a driver's control in a way that, say, a sudden tire blowout genuinely isn't. If you're the kind of driver who's gotten into the habit of running your tank down to the last possible mile before refueling, purely as a matter of routine rather than active fuel price hunting, this is worth reconsidering, regardless of whether prices are currently high or not, simply because the margin for error on a motorway specifically is so much smaller than on ordinary roads. Electric vehicle drivers aren't exempt from this same underlying principle either, worth mentioning given how much of the current fleet has shifted toward EVs. Running out of charge on a motorway carries the same careless driving classification and the same potential penalty as running out of fuel, and arguably the planning margin needs to be even wider, given that recharging isn't as simple as pulling into virtually any forecourt the way refueling with petrol or diesel still largely is. If you're planning a longer motorway journey in an EV, building in a genuine buffer beyond your estimated range, particularly accounting for motorway driving typically consuming more charge than the same distance on slower roads, is worth treating as standard practice rather than an occasional precaution. It's worth understanding how this offense interacts with your insurance too, because the consequences don't stop at the fixed penalty and the points themselves. A careless driving endorsement is exactly the kind of entry insurers factor into risk pricing at your next renewal, and 3 points from this specific offense sit on your license for 4 years, visible to any insurer checking your history during that entire period. For a driver who's otherwise built up a clean record and a decent no-claims bonus, a single moment of misjudged fuel planning can genuinely nudge premiums upward for years afterward, layered on top of the £100 fine and whatever recovery charges applied at the time. It's rarely just the immediate cost people underestimate. It's the compounding effect that follows the endorsement around long after the actual afternoon on the hard shoulder is forgotten. There's also a liability angle worth knowing if running out of fuel leads to a collision, which does happen more often than people assume given how quickly following traffic can close the gap on a live motorway lane. If another vehicle strikes yours while you're stationary because you ran out of fuel, insurers and courts generally take the view that you created the hazard through a foreseeable and avoidable failure to plan your journey properly, which can significantly affect how liability gets apportioned, even if the following driver was also traveling too close or too fast for the conditions. Being technically the vehicle that got hit doesn't automatically mean you're free of responsibility for how the situation arose in the first place. So let's bring this together into something you can actually use on your next longer drive. Treat your fuel warning light as a hard deadline to leave at the next exit, not a rough guide you can push past while chasing a specific station. If you're weighing up driving further to save a few pence per liter, do the actual maths on what that saving is really worth against the potential £100 fine, 3 points, and inflated recovery costs if it goes wrong. If you do run dry on a motorway despite all of that, get to the hard shoulder or nearest refuge area, hazards on, and exit from the passenger side away from live traffic while you wait for recovery. And if you're driving electric, build a genuinely wider buffer into your range planning than you might for a petrol or diesel car, given the more limited recharging options if you do misjudge it. It's worth being clear about how this gets enforced in practice too, because it's rarely a police officer specifically watching for empty tanks. Most of these cases arise when a breakdown or highways patrol attends a stranded vehicle already stopped in a live lane and establishes, often simply by asking, that the cause was an empty tank rather than a mechanical fault. National Highways traffic officers and police attending these callouts are generally more focused on getting you and your vehicle off the live carriageway safely first, with the specific offense and penalty being addressed afterward once everyone involved is safely clear of moving traffic. That said, being upfront about what actually happened tends to go better for you than trying to suggest a vague mechanical issue that a recovery mechanic will likely identify as untrue within minutes of examining the vehicle anyway. None of this is designed to make refueling feel like a high-stakes decision every single time you drive. The overwhelming majority of drivers manage their fuel level sensibly, without ever coming close to this situation. But the current environment, Genuinely elevated prices pushing more people to actively hunt for savings means this specific risk has become more relevant than it's been in a while, and the drivers who end up with the fine and the points are almost always the ones who are trying to save a small amount of money and misjudged exactly how far their remaining fuel would actually take them. It's worth ending on a wider point about why this particular rule exists at all, because it's easy to read it as an oddly harsh piece of legislation aimed at an honest mistake. Motorways carry traffic at considerably higher closing speeds than any other road type in the country, and a stationary vehicle in a live lane creates a hazard that's genuinely disproportionate to how it might look from inside your own car. Approach speed differentials of 70 miles an hour or more mean a following driver has only a few seconds to identify a stopped vehicle and react safely, and a meaningful proportion of serious motorway collisions involve exactly this scenario: a vehicle stationary in a live lane for a reason that, with slightly better planning, was entirely avoidable in the first place. The penalty exists specifically to reinforce that the small inconvenience of stopping to refuel slightly earlier than strictly necessary is genuinely nothing compared to the risk created by not doing so. If this helped you understand exactly why this rule exists and what's genuinely at stake if you push your tank too far, hit subscribe, because I'll keep covering the driving rules that catch people out for reasons they never expected. This one in particular tends to surprise even experienced drivers who've been on the road for decades without ever hearing it explained properly. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.